Welcome everyone. This is an amazing turnout. It's so good to see so many people here um, for the celebration of Fredric Jameson's The Political Unconscious, 40 years on. I'm Rob Talley, a professor of English at Texas State University, and I'm serving as chair, but I want to give a shout out to Andrew Cole, who did a lot of the, most of the organizing of this, and certainly deserves credit for putting everything together. I'm going to very briefly introduce everyone before we begin, and then each of our speakers will give a brief presentation before Fred gives his response, and then we should have some time for Q&A afterwards, which I guess we'll try to do via the chat function if we can. So anyhow, welcome. Our speakers today are Ian Balfour, who is a professor emeritus of English at York University. He is the author of a number of things, including Northrop Frye, The Rhetoric of Romantic Prophecy, and many essays on Romanticism, Walter Benjamin, Paul de Man, and many other topics. We also have Andrew Cole, professor of English at Princeton University, where he directs the Gauss Seminars in Criticism. Among his many works are The Birth of Theory and a forthcoming work on the dialectic of space, as well as a co-authored book with Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruda on Marx. Jonathan Culler is the class of 1916 professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell University. His many books include Structuralist Poetics, which was the winner of the MLA's James Russell Lowell Prize, The Pursuit of Signs, Literary Theory, a Very Brief Introduction, and Theory of the Lyric. He's also past president of the American Comparative Literature Association and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Sianne Ngai, professor of English at University of Chicago. Her books include Ugly Feelings, Our Aesthetic Categories, Zany, Cute, and Interesting, which is also the winner of the Lowell Prize. Most recently, Theory of the Gimmick, Aesthetic Judgment and Capitalist Form. And then we also have Neferti Tadiar, professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College and director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Columbia University. She is the author of Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Makings of Globalization, Fantasy Production, Sexual Economies, and Other Philippine Consequences for the New World Order, which was awarded the Philippine National Book Award for Cultural Criticism in 2005. And she is the co-editor with Angela Davis of Beyond the Frame, Women of Color and Visual Representation. And then, of course, I'm honored to present my old professor and friend, Fredric Jameson, who is the Knut Schmidt Nielsen Professor of Comparative Literature, Professor of Romance Studies, and Director of the Center for Critical Theory at Duke University. He is the author of more than 20 books, including, of course, The Political Unconscious, Marxism and Form, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, yet another winner of the Lowell Prize, Archaeology is the Future, more recently, The Antinomies of Realism, which won the Truman Capote Award, Allegory and Ideology, and just this past year, The Benjamin Files. He's also received the 2008 Holberg Prize and is a recipient in 2011 of the MLA's Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, everybody. Ian?
I want to thank Andrew and Robert for organizing. Very glad to be part of this. So we were asked at one point to provide titles, and mine is What Was to Be Done. For starters, I note that one sentence in the grand introduction to the political unconscious runs for 18 lines, over 180 words, and turns out in the end to be a question. You can likely guess that this sentence about large-scale historical forces charted and entailed in Lévi-Strauss engages the idea and actuality of totality that so occupies Jameson across his work. The commitment to dialectical thinking informs his writing at a granular level, especially the sentence form, but also the footnote and the disposition of materials. A refreshing feature of the political unconscious is how varied the length of the chapters is. What one gets is what needs to have been said. The overarching historical imperative, Jameson contends, is, for, I'm quoting, collective struggle to wrest a realm of freedom from a realm of necessity. And Jameson performs something of this in his own text, Socialism in One Book, as it were. What sort of intervention was the political unconscious, appearing on the cusp of the 80s? As the 70s wound down or up, interest in theory in the humanities was hovering around its high watermark, and people in departments other than literature were paying a lot of attention to what people in lit departments were thinking about rhetoric, narrative, emplotment, and interpretation pretty darn generally. Various structuralisms and post-structuralisms had posited language as the most encompassing category for understanding culture and more. Jameson countered by proposing politics as the absolute horizon of all reading and interpretation. That stands at the highest fourth level in the fourfold scheme of interpretation recast from medieval hermeneutics, a model reaffirmed in the recent book on allegory and ideology. It was partly in response to post-structuralism's various challenges to interpretation traditionally understood and to the critique of totalizing schemes that Jameson restated in a finer tone claims for interpretation and totality. In the political unconscious, the ones made for a certain totality are extravagant. The mystery of the cultural past can be enacted only if the human adventure is one. Moreover, matters of the past can recover their urgency for us only if they are retold within the unity of a single great collective story. Famous phrase, Bruce Robbins has written interestingly about it in Duke's own SAQ. For Hegel, the thinking of the one was the beginning of thought proper, at least from within religion, prior even to philosophy. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel took a stab at epitomizing this one story in one sentence. I quote, "The history of the world is nothing other than the progress of the concept of freedom," end quote. Does one have to choose absolutely between a totalizable history and recognition of difference all the way down or almost? Not necessarily, to judge by the recent work of Atto Sekiotu on left universalism. The anti-Hegelian Walter Benjamin resisted totalizing historical narratives, at least late on and in principle, understanding history as a relation of one moment to another, even though the angel of history sees one single catastrophe. What Jameson calls in his new book on Benjamin a phantom totality is not exactly given, not present for knowledge all at once or ever, but stands as a kind of regulative idea to orient thinking. That is its practical value, borne out variously in local analyses. Jameson's totality is a more complex affair than the older Lukácsian variety. It's articulated more via Althusser, together with an imperative to think the layered discourse of the unconscious, desire being the driving force and operative category. One of the admirable features of Jameson's theory and practice is to have a capacious Marxism as a bedrock interpretive framework, but able to mobilize any number of other interpretive procedures from the likes of Frey, Cremas, and more. Had there been World in Time more for the intro to the political unconscious, I might like to have seen more of an Auseinandersetzung, a coming to terms with the procedures of the older new criticism and then recent deconstruction, though Jameson, of course, did some of this elsewhere. Were there to be, some of my colleagues are going to ask more pressing political questions in a minute, but perversely, I want to end by airing an idea about philology. Were there to be a reboot of the introduction now, I might like to know how Jameson would situate his thoughts on interpretation in relation to the history of philology, not least of the more adventurous sort, ranging, say, from Vico to Schlegel to Schleiermacher to Nietzsche and Timpanaro and maybe Werner Hamacher and Barbara Cassin. I recall wondering in the 70s why someone like Jameson took the time to translate Dilthey's historical cum programmatic essay on the rise of hermeneutics. But that was only one of the methodological traditions Jameson worked through in themselves and for what they can contribute to a Marxist hermeneutic. The hermeneutic tradition thought deeply, sometimes in dialectical fashion, as did Schleiermacher, about the poles of subject and object that organized much of the political unconscious. Some advanced thinking and philosophically informed philology is already Marxist or roughly compatible with it. Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station began with Marx's encounter with Vico, whose allegorical hermeneutic for history included attention to something like class struggle. Closer to Jameson's home, there's Adorno, whose great Parataxis essay reflects on philological practice. Heidegger is his object, his target. Or more emphatically, there's Benjamin. The words philology or philological occur some dozen times in Jameson's new book on Benjamin, highly recommended, by the way. Maybe it behooves us to ponder a proposition Jameson cites from around the theses on the concept of history, where Benjamin could posit that, and I'm ending here, quote, "The historical method is a philological one." Thanks.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone. So the question for scholars today, looking at the political unconscious 40 years on, is how we may continue to write books like this, and what it takes in our present day to do so, because the question of how we can write in this capacious mode draws attention to questions posed by the traditions from which the political unconscious emerged as a significant advance, which is to say Marxism and the analysis of class and culture, the critique of ideology and its institutional expression, the rationalization and reification of our work and play lives, and our utopian wish to have everything be otherwise. That is what the political unconscious is about, and that is precisely how the book responded to its moment as a meditation on processes in capitalism that are both deep, ensuring a fundamental alienation in our lives, and broad and affecting everyone on the globe. The proposal of writing more books like this means not only to practice committed criticism, but to sustain a method where the conditions of that very labor, however local or global, figure centrally in acts of interpretation. It therefore boggles the mind that there's a tendency today, under the banner of post-critique and any number of new reading programs decorated with an adjective, to do the opposite of what's attempted in this book. This focus on reading is curious. It used to be that the issue of reading was the problem of close reading, which was what you grabbed onto to beat back history, historicism, and politics. Today, the slogans about reading at whatever distance, at whatever speed, aren't really new because they are still an effort to vitiate books like The Political Unconscious. In fact, using this very book as their point of departure. To tell authors that they shouldn't read the way they do is really to say they shouldn't write at all. That it'd be better if the political unconscious didn't even exist, so supposedly flawed are its readings. This critical desire is exactly consistent with a conservative and liberal wish to shoo away radical texts that would have anyone thinking about labor, art, and life in capitalism. Moreover, the book has been critiqued over the years for not reading as a manifesto or policy paper, the which opinion really means to say that Jameson wrote the political unconscious the wrong way, and how dare he do a work of literary criticism, to boot an ambitious one. The demand for this book to stay in its lane and become a manifesto is redolent of neoliberal consensus, not only to neutralize the political unconscious, but to instrumentalize it and to know it in advance, which is an unfortunate but not surprising demand in academic institutions where it is increasingly easier to reward the safe and the same. There's so much critical focus, for example, on Jameson's always historicize, as if there's nothing after the first sentence of the political unconscious, however long that sentence is, and as if always historicize means simply to read a history book before writing a piece of literary criticism. But that's what it means to some who wouldn't even do that. I can't think of any other book about which it's not an insult to say that the book makes you put it down and read other people, because each page is a portal to some thinker, author, or idea you should know more about. For my part, Jameson's Political Unconscious got me to reading Northrop Frye. In chapters 2 and 5, Jameson engages Frye on the interpretation of the genre of romance. Taking Frye's idea that romance at all times involves a host of ethical binaries, Jameson proposes that the binaries in romance arise at specific times in history, the 12th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, and can thus be read as imaginary resolutions to sharpened historical contradictions felt in the transition in modes of production, cultural styles, or everyday social life. Thus is Jameson's dialectical use, quote unquote, of Frye's genre criticism, whereby the formal is, yes, the formal, as well as the historical. My question is whether we can add two other terms to say that form is history, is theory, is dialectics. Look at Frye, for example. I don't think it's ever been pointed out that in two books, The Anatomy of Criticism and Secular Scripture, Frye axiomatically pairs dialectics with romance, and he thinks that the aforementioned ethical binary is indeed dialectical. Quote, "The central form of romance is dialectical. Everything is focused on a conflict between the hero and the enemy," unquote. Now, it does seem that Frye's definition of dialectical is more along the lines of Manichaean, but Frye often seeks to render his notion of dialectical to be properly dialectical, when in Secular Scripture he speaks of the interdependence of oppositions and suggesting that for the romance writer, quote, "both his idyllic and his demonic worlds are a mixture of the two," unquote. Frye also claims that there is, quote, "something inherently revolutionary about romance," unquote, and that there is, quote, "an element of social protest inherent in romance," unquote. Interesting. Finally, Frye considers romance to be a transitional form, and in saying so, he resists the urge to speak of transitions that are historical, but nonetheless uses patently eventful historicist tropes to talk about purely ahistorical literary invention. Whatever people think or don't think about Frye now, we can say this: Frye attempts dialectics and thinks dialectical theory when he ponders romance. To some questions then. Perhaps Frye's thinking on romance is already amenable to the political unconscious for these reasons and in ways we have not yet appreciated. Or perhaps for the reason that Hegel and Marx are faintly audible in Frye's formulations about romance. After all, Frye read Hegel and Marx and loved and hated them. On the one hand, we might conclude that a pure history of form is impossible after Hegel and Marx for historical reasons above and beyond what reading discipline you choose to practice, which is to say, the dialectic is sedimented in the genre of romance. On the other hand, we might study romance as a utopian form in tension with realism and perhaps sci-fi, because the genre is central to social engagement at the level of the political unconscious and, why not, the political preconscious and the political conscious. For example, the Black radical tradition has a long history of engagement with romance, from at least W.E.B. Du Bois's use of the genre in his 1928 novel, The Dark Princess, to the traditions from the 1930s to the present that have recently been named Afro-Surrealism, in which we find authors adopting romance motifs in the mode of critique, a practice that Amiri Baraka described in one instance as, quote, dialectical. Yogita Goyal's book entitled Romance, Diaspora, and Black Atlantic Literature excellently illuminates Du Bois's romances, taking up Jameson's insights on the genre in Political Unconscious. And Robin D.G. Kelly and D. Scott Miller are essential on the topic of Afro-Surrealism, among others. There's much more to say and to add, but I mentioned in closing Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation as a pertinent critical mode with generic significance. Quote, "I wanted to write a romance," Hartman says, "of her scholarly commitments, a, quote, romance of resistance to raise important questions regarding what it means to think historically about matters still contested in the present and about life eradicated by the protocols of intellectual disciplines," unquote. Hartman's to think historically alongside Jameson's thinking historically, that's a quote, which is behind the imperative to always historicize. I juxtapose these aforementioned projects and histories of practice not to say that they are identical, so much as to open up conversations about ways of thinking historically through a genre like romance. It is also to speculate that the genre of romance is uniquely generative for committed art and criticism. We can, for example, contemplate the place of romance in the history of radical thought and practice, while also noting its absence in certain other traditions in modernity, be it Cartesianism, Kantianism, or Soviet realism a la Maxim Gorky. Focusing on the histories of radical thought, we can discover romance to be less a genre and more a mode that's activated in our critical, archival, and artistic praxis, a mode we meet halfway and help bring into being in moments of crisis. An engagement, I might add, that isn't always in the manner of that other genre, tragedy. Romance is differently responsive to history. In opposition to realism, it doesn't reflect history, but refracts history, breaks history open to create a cotemporal space where the past, present, and future persist. This is the space of utopian desire, the place of possibility for things not as they are, but as they can be. Committed critique, whether in 1981 or 2021, whether about romance or something else, will ask the most pressing, the most relevant, the most engaged questions about literature and writing. And I can't be persuaded that this work should stop, not now, not ever.
Thanks. So it's a pleasure to take part in this celebration of the retrospective for the political unconscious, which is also, of course, a celebration of the extraordinary career and the extraordinary body of work that Fred has produced over the years. As a specialist in critical theory, I naturally read The Political Unconscious when it was published in 1981, and seeing that it was clearly an important book, collaborated on a special issue of Dialectics devoted to it. As we know, the book offers an extraordinarily sophisticated, comprehensive, non-reductive version of Marxist theory and criticism. Jameson writes, confronted with other interpretive methods, the ethical, the psychoanalytic, the myth critical, the semiotic, the structural, the theological, against which it must compete, Marxism is here conceived as that untranscendable horizon that subsumes such apparently antagonistic and incommensurable critical operations, assigning them an undoubted sectoral validity within itself and thus at once canceling and preserving them. Now, in the context of the theory wars of the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, such claims to incorporate and situate the insights of other critical approaches in its model could not but be seen as a power play, aiming to demonstrate the superiority of Marxism to all other interpretive and theoretical frameworks, as indeed it was. Of course, to incorporate the insights of other critical approaches risks vitiating those insights by denying their claims to account for other theoretical perspectives. And it's certainly possible to question also the fundamental presumption of what Jameson famously called, in lines Ian has already cited, the unity of a single great collective story, the collective struggle to wrest a realm of freedom from the realm of necessity, struggle whose traces his multi-level interpretive project will reveal. Can we believe that, as he writes, the human adventure is one? I mean, are there not multiple stories here? And one can also ask whether the utopian horizon that serves as teleology for this single story is not really a wishful attempt to manage the deeper pessimism that seems these days especially seems amply warranted by multiple threats humanity confronts today. So these critiques are certainly possible, but returning to political unconscious after 40 years for this program, I'm struck above all not by the possibility of such critiques, but by a sense that even though the book claims the perspectives of Marxism as, I quote here, the perspectives of Marxism as the necessary precondition for adequate literary comprehension. In fact, what emerges, particularly in the final chapter on Conrad, is a result that need not seem particularly Marxist at all, in that its categories of periodization and mode of production, Jameson writes, and I quote, draw on a linear fiction or diachronic construct solely for the purpose of constructing a synchronic model of coexistence, non-synchronous development, temporal overlay, the simultaneous presence within a concrete textual structure of what Raymond Williams calls residual and emergence or emergent or anticipatory discourses. So Jameson insists that it's no longer a matter of determining whether a given text belongs to a particular socioeconomic conjuncture by which it was overdetermined, but of tracing in each text the wide variety of forces at work and the ways it appears from at different levels of consideration or from different angles of consideration. A succinct example is a paper delivered in 1982, a year after The Political Unconscious, Baudelaire as Modernist and Postmodernist. There, Jameson does not proceed in the manner of Walter Benjamin to reductively diagnose Baudelaire as a symptom of nascent capitalism, but works to identify the multiple strata of a complex text responsive to different critical vantage points, a text which selects and retains much of the past as it projects a future. There are, he explains, many Baudelaires. First, the post-romantic Baudelaire, whom he rather cavalierly dismisses. Second, I quote, the Baudelaire contemporary of himself and of Flaubert, the Baudelaire of the break of 1857, the Baudelaire, the eternal freshness of whose language is bought by reification, who he grants is the hardest to grasp and of whom he chooses not to speak, perhaps because it's just a short essay. And third, there is the Baudelaire inaugural poet of high modernism, of a today extinct high modernism. And fourth, the Baudelaire of postmodernism, of our own immediate age of consumer society. So this is an extraordinarily complex Baudelaire, graspable at multiple levels, product of divergent, conflicting forces, where the perspectives of the interpreter or interpreters need to be integrated in any attempt at comprehensive description. As he remarks elsewhere, the dialectic requires you to say everything simultaneously, whether you think you can or not. And it requires shifts in levels and shifts in vantage points. So I evoke this case as a succinct example of how a Jamesonian analysis ends up positing sort of synchronous coexisting forces, as illustrated at greater length in the very rich account of Conrad's Lord Jim and Nostromo in the final chapter of The Political Unconscious, where he detects in Conrad not just the elements of the pre-modern, of realism, of expressionism, of modernism, and even a certain postmodernism, but especially the tense interrelation of such elements. Conrad's stylistic practice, he writes, can be grasped as a symbolic act which, seizing on the real in all its reified resistance, at one and the same time projects a unique sensorium of its own, a libidinal resonance, no doubt historically determinate, yet whose ultimate ambiguity lies in its attempt to stand beyond history. Or again, this is the delicate part of the modernist project, the place at which it must be realistic in order in another moment to recontain that realism which it has awakened. The ideological and the utopian are always implicated in a literary practice such as Conrad's and in a thought such as Jameson's, which insists on the dialectical transcendence of such oppositions and finds utopian impulses even in the most retrograde forms of class consciousness. It's possible for a text, he writes, to embody a utopian impulse or to resonate a universal value inconsistent with the narrower limits of class privilege which inform its more immediate ideological vocation. For a reader today, it seems to me, less concerned perhaps about which critical school can claim to have the upper hand, there is in The Political Unconscious a potent resistance to what he calls the instrumentalization of culture, which is, he writes, a temptation or tendency within all Marxisms. And because of this resistance, at a time when critics, both young and old, seem all too eager to condemn this or that text for its complicity with the various evils of our modernity, Jameson's theory and practice is both extraordinarily refreshing and a cause for hope. Thanks.
I'm up now, right, Rob? In History and Class Consciousness, Lukács describes mediation as a, quote, lever with which to overcome the mere immediacy of the empirical world. He is thinking of reification, the main concept of that book, and also of Weber's rationalization. Both are processes that apply equally to, quote, social relations in capitalism and to, quote, formal relations in the latter's literary products. Lukács makes a tacit distinction between useful mediations and not so useful ones. The latter described as, quote, confusing categories of reflection, the obscuring, quote, mediations of metaphysics and myth. Jameson follows Lukács in The Political Unconscious. similarly describing mediation as a, quote, device of the analyst, whereby the fragmentation of social life is at least locally overcome. He dedicates the bulk of his intro to making a list of dubious analytical moves, including many favored by Marxist critics, that are essentially bad mediations, while offering the more detailed account Lukács does not offer as to why they are dissatisfying. At the same time, Jameson clarifies that all mediations, bad or good, involve, quote, transcoding, quote, making connections among the seemingly disparate phenomena of social life, which kind of boils down to identifying a likeness or pattern of recursion across social levels. Reification in modernist artworks, for example, in their fragmentation of the sensorium, replicates while remaining ultimately distinct from the reification of commodities and the rationalization of labor and capitalist production. So mediations are devices for counteracting false immediacy, such as how the capitalist world necessarily appears to us through the senses as subdivided and compartmentalized. Not all of these devices are equally effective. The theory of literary interpretation should offer some insight on how to distinguish good mediations from bad ones, and especially since both involve pointing out some sort of resemblance. Now, the political unconscious makes it clear that the distinction between good and bad mediations matters. Crude economisms that reduce capitalist social life to the market and capitalist ideology to liberalism, it's amazing how it always gets shrunk down to those two words. Contemplative attitudes that in presuming the gulf between a subject and object end up widening that gulf. The historicist errors that Althusser castigates as mechanical and expressive causality, all of these unsatisfying interpretative devices show how difficult it is for our reified minds to do something that on paper sounds extremely simple. Grasp two things, say an aesthetic form and a financial form, as branchings of the same unity, without equating them, reducing one to the other, or assuming that one must be the cause of the other. But these ways of thinking are so automatic and entrenched in our everyday activities that even for local and transient traction on a total social process, rendered empirically inaccessible by capitalism's real abstractions, the analyst will need a, quote, invention, a, quote, lever, a device. And given the meticulous analysis of bad mediations with which the political unconscious begins, it seems like only the right device will do. Of all these unsatisfactory interpretive mechanisms that are cataloged at the beginning of the book, the one singled out most is homology. It comes at the end and almost as a precipitate of Jameson's much lengthier discussion of expressive causality. Expressive causality is Althusser's main antagonist in Reading Capital. Althusser's overarching example of his problem with Hegelian mediation. But Jameson suggests that expressive causality isn't ultimately as scary a danger as Althusser makes it out to be. Quote, the true target of the Althusserian critique would seem to me not to be the practice of mediation, but something else, which presents superficial similarities to it, but is in reality a very different kind of concept, namely the structural notion of homology, or isomorphism, or structural parallelism, a term currently in wide use in a variety of literary analyses. That was a quote. In Marxism and Form, Jameson's example is the historicism of homology, as the historicism of Taine and Spengler, who in their efforts to, quote, giving an account of the total style of a culture, try to, quote, demonstrate the unity of that cultural style as it envelops everything from engineering techniques and mathematical thinking to religious dogma and literary convention. In the political unconscious, the example is Lucien Goldman's The Hidden God, which constructs parallels between class situations, worldviews, and artistic forms in order to argue that, quote, at some level of abstraction, the structure of the three different realities is the same. So homologies are problematic in the political unconscious. They are, quote, static, misguided, comfortable, and above all, abstract. But when we turn 30 years later to Valences of the Dialectic, 2010, we encounter something more neutrally presented as, quote, the ideological replication of form, what leaves its imprint on the organization of superstructures, whether theoretical, political, or artistic, end quote. Jameson's main example is what Marx calls cooperation, that politically ambiguous organization of labor power, at once intensifying exploitation, but important for any, quote, association of free men, which, quote, can be observed in the structure of the 19th century novel, Jameson writes, with its immense increase in personnel and the reorganization around protagonists and levels of minor characters organized into a kind of proletariat anonymous background. You can hear Alex Wallach there. If the mode of similarity being discussed here, the recurrence of a form across social realities as different as the novel, the industrial workplace, and a critical text by Marx, is essentially the same mode of similarity as the one highlighted in the political unconscious, it seems interestingly less directly repudiated. And in Representing Capital from 2011, we encounter something called, quote, dialectical synonymity. Quote, the process whereby a critique is waged on several levels of implication at once. The example offered is taken again from Capital. Marx is singling out of the principle of equivalence, which we see primarily played out in economic exchange, but also in the realms of mathematics, political theory, law, and psychology. Like the replication of the social form of cooperation, this mode of similarity is also presented neutrally, maybe even admiringly, as a useful tool for disclosing, quote, the patterns and functions and operation of the system as it is replicated in all the multitudinous subsystems that make up capitalist life everywhere. So the question is, what is the relation between ideological replication of form, dialectical synonymity, and homology? Are these three modes of similarity, all enlisted as mediations for cultural analysis, the same mode of similarity, or are they meaningfully different? And there's a sense in which this is the overarching question asked across all of Jameson's work, insofar as each of his books explores the future of dialectical thinking. Consider this moment from Representing Capital, in which Jameson offers, quote, a hypothesis about the very origins of dialectic itself. For I believe that the dialectic came into being to handle a strange and unparalleled historical situation, namely one in which everything is different, yet remains the same, in which history reveals the enormous structural disparities, not only between ancients and moderns, but between all the different historical modes of production, exclamation point. And yet in another sense, they are all the same thing, namely modes of production. By the same token, history reveals the immense variety of groups which exercise dominion over other groups, castes, feudal orders, clans, families, hordes, and finally, unique to our moment, social classes. And yet in another sense, they are all social classes, all somehow the same, a ruling class extracting its surplus value from a laboring class. Dialectic, Jameson concludes, is, quote, a mode of thinking able to combine the singular and the general in a unique way, or better still, to shift gears from one to the other and back again, to identify them in such a way that they remain different. Dialectic and its lever, mediation, are thus isomorphic. Both enable us to, quote, shift gears between the singular and the general. Both rely on similarity, which, as Jonathan Flatley brilliantly shows us, is itself dialectical, the unity and difference of sameness and difference. This is Flatley, and like Andy Warhol. Being alike is both experientially and conceptually distinct from being equal or identical. As Jean-Luc Nancy observes, quote, the like is not the same. Indeed, when something is like something else, it means precisely that it is not the same as it. Things that are alike are neither incommensurate nor identical. They are related and resembling, yet distinct. Similarity is a discrete concept apart from the same different opposition. That's Flatley. So if homology is in a certain sense forgiven over Jameson's work over the decades via the accrual of multiple similar levers or modes of similarity in the analytical tool chest, it is not, however, because it is immune to error. We are still going to have to deal with confusing categories of reflection, the mediations of metaphysics and myth. Error, however, is looked at far less harshly in Jameson's writing than we sometimes remember. In valences, for example, the static binaries, the contemplative abstractions, and the one-sided reflections of Verstand or understanding in the science of logic are read as necessary crutches. Contrivances, yeah, but that can't be abandoned even if we try because they are part of everyday thinking. Reading Verstand as the comic villain of the science of logic, as Jameson delightfully suggests that we do, involves tracking how this veritable incarnation of reification paradoxically develops as it creatively adapts itself to the realm of being, then essence, and finally notion, while always remaining comically the same Verstand. The idea that even error is capable of dialectical movement recalls one of the political unconsciousness most important insights, which is that reifying thinking is often astonishingly generative, a thought that anticipates the famous culminating chapter on ideology and utopia. What we might therefore call the political unconsciousness affective arc from Gothic to comedy, how it opens by inculcating our anxious vigilance against making errors, but then shows error to be, quote, always a stage in truth and part of the latter, ultimately shows us how to be less fearful in our interpretative practices.
Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to be on this panel. And it's really good to see you, Fred. I should have said that earlier. Okay, when I first agreed to do a rereading of the political unconscious, as Andrew had suggested, I wondered how it would fare in a present arguably quite different from the moment in which it was written. And there are a whole number of ways you might characterize that. How might we think about the political unconscious, say, in an era when representation and critique are just so much content to maintain channels of flow for social networks and capitalist platforms, when mediation or transcoding is the means or device of popular cultural politics and financial ventures alike, and here the Gramus semantic rectangle seems to have been repurposed as a popular meme, when a structural totality is widely accepted as a social fact and hermeneutic necessity, and the end of global capitalism is eminently conceivable. I've been thinking of the phenomenon of murderous policing in the Philippines in Duterte's war on drugs, carried out as socially symbolic acts. Here, police and mercenaries carry out extrajudicial killings as a form of writing, using the murdered bodies of accused drug users as surfaces to write messages and various hashtags, drawing smiley faces on the fully taped heads of the killed, prompting one journalist to describe the style of killings as murder as meme. The killings also became the instruments of lucrative enterprises, with each killing garnering financial compensation and serving as an occasion for the proliferation of other kinds of monetary and other gain, extortion of suspects, ransom of kidnapped suspects and their relatives, commissions for authorized funeral parlors, ransom of dead bodies, etc. A situation another journalist describes as murder as enterprise. I mentioned this specific phenomenon of our present in part because the mode of killings can certainly be read as a cultural form along the lines Jameson proposes, that is, as offering a solution to the specific social contradictions of Philippine life, though not only on a symbolic, aesthetic, or ideological level, as the political unconscious argues, but also directly on the level of material social life, directly yielding practical, bodily, social, and monetary effects. In this context, as in the context of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-immigrant policing and punishment in the US, humans are mere media for socio-symbolically staged events through which contracted and securitized values are realized for individuals as well as for nations. Elsewhere, I write about this cultural form in terms of the logic of derivatives to highlight a structural relation between these forms of racialized disposability and platform capitalism, which here I can only suggest has to do with the rise of mediation itself as a central site and object of financial speculation and cultural production. We see this phenomenon of the practice and means of connection and movement or circulation taking precedence over the production of goods in the rise of mega platforms such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon, as well as in the rise of financial derivative and cryptocurrency markets. Indeed, the practice of transcoding between seemingly disparate levels of reality proposed as an interpretive method has become the basis of all sorts of economic and cultural production, everything from these complicated pricing and contract schemes of finance, which disassemble and reassemble attributes of things into other kinds of entities to speculate on, to the kinesthetic sex, gender, and race performances on TikTok, where transcoding reigns as a device of pleasure and sociality making performances. These are examples, or if you will, fractal repetitions of a logic of derivatives, which we can understand as developing out of and possibly superseding at a higher level of abstraction that process of reification or systemic breaking up of older unities and autonomization of the resulting fragments, which Jameson sees as a historical dynamic of capitalist life and a key interpretive code. So while it would seem that these examples of contemporary sociocultural texts militate against the interpretive method proposed, in fact, the political unconscious provides us with the very tools for understanding them. Through the method of enlarging horizons of interpretation, we are made aware of other planes of action, able to see these particular cultural forms as reality-making moves in a, quote, essentially polemic and strategic, but I would say no longer only ideological confrontation between classes. The sense that antagonism drives and shapes cultural forms, their intelligibility and practical effectivity, even or especially as they operate in an altered terrain, seems to me to be absolutely essential, for it compels us to pry apart what would appear to be a unifying hegemony of practice into oppositional tendencies. But I would venture that we need to move to the last interpretive horizon to understand another dimension of these same contemporary cultural forms. This brings me to what I have always found singularly compelling in the political unconscious, and what I remain compelled by today, which is the concept of cultural revolution. For only if we register precisely, quote, that permanent struggle between the various coexisting modes of production, can we grasp the otherwise unrecognizable or illegible meaning and implications of the same practices that appear to be only the effect of capitalist processes. When so much criticism has sealed off the present as well as the future in a mystifying characterization of global capitalism as historically complete, or as thoroughly dominated by its most advanced tendencies, it is this idea of cultural revolution that allows us to probe the very insides of the latest mode of capitalism for those outsides that are other sociocultural modes of survival within it. It urges us to consider those very critical analyses of capitalism as strategies of repression and containment of other political energies seeking form and force. To rewrite these contemporary cultural practices with respect to other modes of production, I believe, is the task of decolonizing anti-capitalist, anti-racist critique. It is a task that requires the provincializing of the interpretive codes of the Western European tradition and the honing of literacies in the cultural codes of other modes of living, which creatively persist in the interfaces with the most advanced modes of capitalist life, not simply as archaic leftovers of the past, but also as the consequence of and resistance to those modes of imperialism, racism, and heterosexism internal to capitalism, through which the persistent survival of other social formations is forcibly converted into enabling milieus for more proper capital-labor relations. In a moment of global disaster and overt barbarism, when the collapse of capitalism is imminently imaginable and all kinds of dystopic totalities are readily affirmed, the reminder of, quote, the negative and methodological status of the concept of totality is especially important to bear in mind. In this moment, we need more than ever a sensibility of the differences that such a methodological abstraction allows us to perceive. And the interpretation of those differences seem to warrant a transcoding practice, not just between levels of reality or between symbolic and material aspects of an indissolubly unified social life, but rather also between kinds of reality happening simultaneously within the same present. This is the kind of interpretation that is consistent with the expanded theoretical political framework envisioned by Jameson, for which he writes, the transformation of our dominant mode of production must be accompanied and completed by an equally radical restructuration of all the more archaic modes of production with which it structurally coexists. The vigilant awareness of the limits of imagination, ours as well as others, implied in the notion of ideological repression, and the profoundly generative idea of history itself as the, quote, untranscendable limit of our understanding in general, are, to my mind, what makes for the continuing radical power of the political unconscious. That power is to be gleaned in Jameson's concluding remarks on the need for both positive and negative poles of Marxist hermeneutics, which today I read as urging an anticipatory collective interpretation of our present global situation. It is only, however, through an expanded interpretive framework comprised of cultural or political ontological codes that are made extrinsic to capitalism proper, that we might strive toward the emergence of some as yet unrealized planetary collectivity and consciousness out of this global catastrophe, without losing sight of that will to domination which Jameson reminds us perseveres intact, not only in the arena of art and culture, but in every solution for our global condition now proffered from the vaccine to Zoom. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. I would just want to mention before turning things over to Fred that some of the audience may be confused that Rebecca Comey should have been here. She had to cancel, unfortunately, so we don't get to have her comments, but she was part of the planning of all this, so I did want to just acknowledge her. And now I'd like to turn things over to Fredric Jameson. You gotta unmute. Yeah.
Okay, how about that?
There you go.
All right. Authors don't always know the meaning or usefulness of their work for other people. Meanwhile, a public whose interest has been aroused by the work is often disappointed to find out what the author originally intended by it. At any rate, though by this time it's certainly more interesting, for me at least, to find out what other people saw in the political unconscious than what I originally meant to do in it. I'll begin with the latter as a matter of historical record. Then I'll comment briefly on some of the themes touched on by these papers today: mediation, totality, time, the unity of history, romance, genre, and finally maybe utopia and fascism. And I'll conclude by telling you how I myself would want to use this book today, which is maybe a little different than it was when I wrote it. Now, I was writing these chapters in a period of great theoretical effervescence and development in both Marxism and psychoanalysis. It'd be enough to mention the names of Lacan and Althusser to remind you of that moment. But although there was much cross relationship between them, particularly in France, there didn't seem to be any very systematic attempt to theorize that relationship. And particularly in this country, there didn't exist much in the way of a discussion of their literary or cultural consequences. So what interested me was not only a new and more complex view of both these currents of thought, but also their realignment. Not just another Freudo-Marxism, but the harnessing of these two bodies of thought to practical literary criticism. So in a way, I was attempting to spell out a concept invented by my old friend and antagonist, Jean-François Lyotard, with his slogan of libidinal economy. The idea that both Freudianism and Marxism were drives, and that the political was as libidinal as the other kind, and that its investment in the work demanded an attention at least equal to that traditionally accorded to the other, should we say, more respectable impulses. The political, on my view then and now, is the heightened excitement awakened by the intersection of individual experience with the presence of the collective. So the political unconscious was designed to demonstrate that the life and value of a text lay in the hidden kindling of a collective spark in its representations. And that representation was, as it were, the sail that has to be set to catch the winds of collectivity. I called this history, and I still would, although many changes in our current situation today might demand a somewhat different formulation, which I'll come to later on. As for the themes of these commentaries today, I want to take that of mediation first, because the book was also a confrontation with the one model of Marxist literary criticism that had a certain influence in that period, namely the work of Lucien Goldmann. In particular, The Hidden God of 1955 offered a historical materialist study of Jansenism, and in particular Pascal and Racine, which could scarcely be overlooked. This study was path-breaking insofar as Goldmann took as his category of analysis not class, but a class fraction. And he linked the Jansenist structure of feeling, a concept of Raymond Williams from much the same period, to the failure of this class fraction to achieve social dominance. That was the famous Noblesse de Rome. He called this structure of feeling tragic and probably had existentialism in mind as a contemporary version of a similar situation. But today we might perhaps want to also grasp his work as an anticipation of the role of melancholy in affect theory. Goldmann's studies of modern literature were, to my mind, less convincing, but what I felt to be, above all, deeply unsatisfying was his conception of mediation as homology, namely the parallelism between forms and social realities, or to put it more bluntly, base and superstructure. I hasten to say that it was not that distinction that bothered me, but rather the mediation between them that he offered, the method of a simple parallelism or isomorphism between such very different kinds of realities. Meanwhile, all this was happening in a period in which any number of Freudo-Marxisms were being launched. And while Goldmann, like any number of Marxists of his generation, had very little interest in Freud, it did seem to me that most of these efforts were equally conceived around homologies or simple parallelisms between Freudian and Marxist drives. Homologies remain a useful pedagogical method, but I have to say that for their most productive use, I would tend to recommend maybe not Goldmann, but Spengler, with his notions of a Baroque religion, a Baroque architecture and painting, a Baroque statecraft, a Baroque mathematics, and so on and so forth. I've already indicated that Lyotard's libidinal apparatuses seem to me a far more suggestive approach to this problem, not parallel forms, but investments in a formal apparatus, about which I'd like to add that that form has its own content, and that's an idea we got from the Danish linguist Hjelmslev. So much then for mediation, and of course Sianne's paper has given you a much more detailed and stimulating review of its internal problems. Let me now say something about time and history. Is history a linear fiction within which we can identify a few synchronous moments that are still somehow present to us? Clearly, the great structuralist issue of diachrony and synchrony is still with us, still a dilemma. But this was also a burning issue for Walter Benjamin, and I talk about it in some length in my new book. But if for linear fiction we substituted the words narrative or narrative construction, perhaps the accusation wouldn't sound quite so bad. But certainly my assertion about the unity of all history still sounds rather extravagant. I would remind us, however, that Marx was a Darwinist, and that the principle of all history surely remains survival, whether at the personal or the collective level, and Spinoza would have agreed. But it gets more complicated and interesting if you remember that the mode of production called capitalism cannot survive without expanding. It lives by way of an inner imperialism, geographical and ecological, as well as economic, and maybe cultural as well. So globalization is a dilemma as well as an opportunity, and the plague, the pandemic, is also an allegory of expansion. that other gloriously expansive and imperialist species, the rat, has today been replaced as a carrier of viral globalization by humans traveling to the far ends of the earth. As for the notion of time that accompanied this notion of history, my later emphasis on space and postmodernity isn't yet, I think, present in this book. But if anything, it tended to imply a broader range of cultural times and temporalities throughout the diachronic, each mode of production, as Althusser put it, producing its own specific mode of temporality. That's certainly philosophically too complicated to begin to thrash out here, but what I would want to conclude on the matter of a unified history is perhaps Sartre's observation that there were once many histories, and it's only in our own period that they're becoming a single history, the history of late capitalism. These have all, however, been totalizing positions, what I've been saying, positions and propositions. And so it's right for us at this point to pass on to the theme of totality, which the political unconscious undoubtedly raises and which has been touched on in several of these commentaries. I don't know whether this is still the burning theoretical and ideological issue it used to be when this book was first published. If not, I think you have to use your imagination to grasp the rift and antagonism the idea of totality staged between its enemies and its adherents, a little like the violent clashes between Protestants and Catholics in the Northern Irish Troubles. Perhaps it was an anticipation of what might today be characterized as an antagonism between Marxists and anarchists, it being understood that today, on both sides, the anarchists have won, but that in the meantime, everyone also agrees on the idea of totality, namely that capitalism is everywhere and has no natural enemies. At any rate, here is a theoretical terrain that was immediately political. I guess I would try to characterize the idea of totality as one of the authority of total knowledge, so that it's, in a Foucauldian sense, so that its adversaries were essentially anti-authoritarian, an important theme in the 60s and 70s and the Vietnam War period. There was the fear also that totality would blot out all the individualities, and in that sense, as some right-wing halfwit once said to me, totality simply meant totalitarianism. There is no such thing as society, Mrs. Thatcher famously said, ranging herself decisively among the enemies of totalization, in the same spirit in which a critic of mine once proved that I was an imperialist because I used the term imperialism. There was certainly a deep fear of the party here, one which perhaps still hampers our conceptions of collective politics, but perhaps there was also a fierce commitment to the autonomy of the work, of the artistic work, which resisted any efforts to place it in the larger context of history, society, or culture. Hegel was also a bad name in this period, and the dialectic a well-nigh sinister and Orwellian process. But today, Hegelians proclaim the end of history, and it's totalizing thinkers who celebrate singularities. So the debate on totality, or perhaps one should rather evoke Lyotard's battle cry, "We must make war on totality," was a historical one that deserves analysis in its own right. I now think that there was a basic misunderstanding at work in that debate, namely that this abhorrent term totality was not to be grasped positively as the name for a value, but rather negatively as a critical instrument. Lukács's foundational expression in History and Class Consciousness evoked, and I'm quoting, an aspiration to totality, and not its totalitarian realization. He meant the resistance to totality to designate what I've called strategies of containment, that is, the systematic and sometimes unconscious efforts to block off parts of reality we don't wish to see or know, to live in a sheltered world in which they don't exist, to ignore them and live in splendid and guilt-free isolation. This is clearly still very much an issue in American social life today, where the privileged want very much not to know about the lives of other social groups and would much prefer that these known unknowns remain unknown unknowns. Perhaps this is true of American empire generally, with that blindness of the center that characterizes all empires, and prefers to ignore the radically different conditions of other places and other lives, to secede from them, and if absolutely necessary, to blot them out of existence. In literature, I think the English language is doing this right now. And so we pass on to the question of globalization and of a non-Western culture, which is scarcely raised in the political unconscious, except perhaps for a passage in which I used Conrad to pinpoint the source of our hostility to Islam. I certainly think that even when we are not consciously thinking about other countries and the world population, this unpresent, invisible framework conditions our personal and political ideologies, just as the status of the nation in the world system unconsciously orients the conscious concerns of its citizens and writers or artists. I'd like to quote a remark of Sloterdijk, namely that no one today has yet really been able to confront the existence of 3 billion other people. For Marxism, however, globalization represents the stage Marx called the world market, and he grasps it as the closed frontier, the moment at which capitalism approaches an absolute limit and thereby its terminal contradictions. But what, to turn to a final theme, what does this totalizing position allow us to say or even understand about the past? This is, I think, the sense of the question about medieval romance and the larger issue of literary genres. Is the past a Ding an sich we can only apprehend by way of our modern categories? Or on the contrary, does modernity or post-modernity represent an enlargement of our capacities to grasp what is radically other and alien? I'm happy to endorse Northrop Frye as a dialectician and to insist on the constitutive role of oppositions in thinking and interpretation. The fact that we cannot analyze pre-capitalist cultures in the same terms we use for capitalism should not prevent us from identifying analogous oppositions in texts like those of romance, where we can read the wish-fulfilling stories of the fairy tale as a peasant narrative in stark class antagonism to the death-laden heroic epics of their feudal landlords. As for genre, it's an even more complicated issue. I follow Lukács's theory of the novel in its basic insight, namely that the novel is not a genre, but follows the destruction of the various pre-capitalist generic traditions. I would simply add that something like larval genres always tend to reform and to reemerge inside the formless novel as story types, which must then, in their turn, be destroyed as they harden over into stereotypes and cliches. Realism, then, as the incessant destruction of earlier realisms, is always a kind of modernism. But I want to press on, and I think I have to press on, to my conclusion, which promises to offer my current views on what I would hope the political unconscious might lead to in the way of new work and new problems. I've already used the word collectivity several times here, and it's around this issue that I'd like to reorient the themes raised by the political unconscious. Around this issue of collectivity, rather than the word itself, for the first point I want to make is that we have no adequate word or concept for collectivity. All are ideologically slanted, as are, one would want to add after Trump's storming of the Winter Palace, those of mob and of populism. The second point is that no form of collectivity is natural or organic. All, including the family itself, are constructed. And indeed, if you want to go that far, nothing is really natural in the older sense of the word anyway. But many concepts claim to be, and that's the philosophical debate current in postmodernity, I think. I should add that social class has never been thought to be a natural category, so that where a pseudo-natural idea like race can only confront the idea of another race as its opposition, the idea of class knows a genuine negation, namely the classless. I also want to affirm that whatever we choose to think about collectivity, past, present, or future, it will be incommensurable with our thoughts about biological, personal, and psychoanalytic individuality. This is why we cannot simply affirm homologies or parallelisms between these two domains, in both of which we participate. I therefore want to see our unconscious, political or otherwise, as a matter of deeper categories, to use Kant's useful term, underlying categories which shape our conscious thoughts and interpretations of groups, the self, and indeed art or literature. What I would want the political unconscious to affirm today is that the political and the aesthetic are not the same, but are informed by deeper shared and more abstract categories, informed by the contradictions of representations, for example, which pose problems in political organization, analogous to those posed in narrative and probably also in questions of personal identity. So we still need to affirm the close affinity of politics, art, and consciousness, but to assert that affinity by way of the exploration of the deeper categories in which they all share or partake, to use Plato's formula. It's those categories which I would want to say today make up a true political unconscious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. And I do apologize. Time got a bit away from me. I realized that we're about to get kicked out of our Zoom space. And so I don't think it's probably likely we really have time for a proper Q&A. I'm told we're going to be removed from here in 5 minutes. So I think instead of Q&A, I would just thank the participants, thank the audience, thank Andrew Cole again for organizing all of this. And thanks especially Fred for writing the book to begin with and for being here to help us rethink it again 40 years later.